Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, Brittney Griner is coming home. They've secured her release. Talk a little bit about what the Biden administration did in order to liberate her from Russia.
So it's important to remember, to give you somewhat of a timeline, Brittney Griner was arrested in mid-February for bringing vape cartridges that had a little bit, very tiny, minimal amounts of marijuana in them, but brought them through a Moscow airport. To give, viewers context, she plays when the WNBA is not in season. She would go overseas and play, and has played in Russia for a number of years now.
NWA basketball star. Yeah.
And so she went over there to join her team, just like she always did, and was arrested. She ultimately was charged with drug possession. She was sentenced to 9 years in prison back in August, which was 1 year short of the maximum sentence allowed. Now, almost immediately, the Biden administration declared that she was being wrongfully detained, and it was not necessarily about, the validity of whether or not she brought the cartridges in. It was about the belief that that she was being overcharged and they were using her as a political pawn. And
because she's an American.
She's an American. She's high profile.
Right.
There's a history of them, taking Americans and wrongfully detaining them. That is, something that's not limited to just Russia, but is, something happening on a much larger scale. But so as it relates to Brittney Griner, there's a lot of pressure, specifically over the summer, to get her back. And we heard the administration make an extraordinary type of announcement in which they said they'd offered a significant proposal to get both Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan home.
Right.
Now, Paul Whelan is another American who the administration considers wrongfully detained. He was first arrested around this time in 2018. He was then sentenced in 2020 to 16 years in prison on espionage charges that he actually denies. And so what we found out now through the last couple hours since it was announced that Brittney Griner was on her way home is that there was not really a possibility at this time for them to get Paul Whelan home. Now it's hard to believe, and the White House has gotten a lot of criticism for leaving Paul Whelan behind a second time, given that they didn't get either of them back when they made an exchange for Trevor Reed back in the spring, and so Paul Whelan was with the espionage charge around him. The U.S. and the Biden administration has said that the Russians are holding on to him and holding him to a different standard than they are with the other Americans, given this espionage charge and the seriousness with which it comes. And so the administration had to release Victor Bout, who's a notorious arms dealer.
Right.
Throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, he was providing significant weapons to various factions in various African nations, sometimes to both sides of a conflict.
Right.
So he, was a very bad guy. He was arrested in a sting operation in 2008. He was sentenced a couple years later to a 25-year prison sentence in the United States, and that sentence was set to expire in 2029.
Right.
So in the next couple of years, he was going to be released from prison and realistically end up back in Russia shortly thereafter.
Right.
The U.S. and the Biden administration decided that this one-for-one swap was a fine offer and took it once they realized that there was no real avenue on the table to get Whelan home at this time. And the administration went as far to say that this wasn't an either-or option. This was a Griner or nothing option. And with that being the options on the table, they decided to get Brittney Griner home.
Right. But obviously the concern for Paul Whelan and his family is once you've traded away Victor Bout, you don't have another asset, or you have to go looking for another asset to trade for him.
Absolutely, and that's a concern that the Whelan family mentioned back when Trevor Reed was released in the spring, and they said, the U.S. just gave up a valuable asset to get Trevor Reed home. That's one fewer asset in the U.S. war chest to get him back. Now the same thing is happening again, and it really is unclear who exactly there is that the U.S. could offer up to get Paul Whelan back.
So we've taken another step toward passing the really big defense spending bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. Talk a little bit about some of the controversies over the bill and just what's in it, how big is it?
So President Biden requested slightly more than $800 billion to fund the Defense Department next year.
Right.
Congress decided that wasn't quite enough, and they offered a little bit of a bonus in $45 billion. So we're talking significant sums of money.
Right.
And so that $45 billion is essentially padding some of the categories that the administration already laid out. A couple more billion here, a couple more billion there. And part of that has to do with things like inflation.
Right.
Obviously, the NDAA was passed at a time when inflation was at a different place. And so the Congress has decided to, make a couple little changes in terms of, pay for soldiers and increase like a raise and how to combat inflation, considering that, things have changed since part of this bill was written. One of the biggest parts of this bill, however, is it repealed the Defense Department's COVID vaccine mandate.
Right.
Now, so that's a pretty big deal, especially because it required Democrats to get on board with it in opposition of where the administration stands and where the Pentagon stands on this.
Right.
But it's important to remember we're talking about a really small section of the military. We're talking the high 90% of DOD and the military itself has been vaccinated. And so for those that haven't, who didn't comply and weren't able to get an exemption, they were discharged.
And there's no reinstatement of those people in this provision at this time.
Correct, at this time. And there are still some hurdles that still have to be cleared in before it becomes fully passed and goes to the president's desk. So there is a little bit of room for some changes, but it's hard to suspect that something that drastic could happen at this point. That being said, we're seeing no conversation about reinstatement or even back pay. And so it's really all about moving forward and making sure that those who are at risk, who are currently unvaccinated and at risk of being separated, it would prevent that.
Now, NDAA tends to be bipartisan, must-pass legislation, so you do usually need input from both parties. And the House passed it under a procedural move that required a 2/3 majority, so even with Democratic control, they needed Republican votes to get to a 2/3 majority. But this is going to be the last NDAA that passes with a Democratic House. And that sort of is a little bit of a change if they want to pursue further reforms of the COVID vaccination mandate, right?
Absolutely. And so there are a number of questions, even up until this point, and even as we know that the vaccine mandate has been, they have decided to rescind it, there are questions along the lines of, has DOD considered, mandating the booster? And we still don't really have many answers on that, or other than that they encourage service members to get a booster.
Right.
But we don't know about that. There are a number of other aspects of this in terms of the long-term viability. We heard Secretary Austin as recently as this week say that this is a matter of military readiness.
Sure.
And that essentially from the Pentagon's perspective, when you require service members to get anywhere from 12 to 17 other vaccines to serve in the military, why should COVID be different than those?
Right. So obviously a question that a lot of Republican lawmakers have raised is that why are we discharging people from the military at a time where we're having difficulty meeting recruitment targets, and some of the vaccine hesitant demographics are particularly or disproportionately recruited to the military?
Absolutely. And so we've heard some leaders of the armed services even reference that this is not helpful, that the mandate is not helpful. Not necessarily. We heard some pushback between the White House, National Security Council, and the Pentagon over whether or not the vaccine mandate is actually impacting readiness. If you take the White House's perspective, they say vaccine hesitancy, not the mandate, is what is actually the real issue at the heart of this.
Sure.
That being said, obviously this doesn't help when you are in a recruiting crisis.
So there's been some interesting developments in the Russian war in Ukraine, where Ukraine is taking on a somewhat different strategy, and the United States maybe seems a little bit hesitant about it.
What we've seen this week has been a dramatic turn of events. We've seen over the last week 3 different Russian military bases get struck. And the presumption is that these are Ukrainian missiles that hit these Russian targets on Russian soil. And so that right there is the defining characteristic of this moment, is that for the first time, Ukraine is actively striking within Russian territory. It brings the war to a new turning point, both as it relates to how Putin is able to conduct it and shield his people from the realities, as well as what could be next.
Sure.
We've seen, the Russian troops. It's well reported that they have, very low morale, that they aren't doing well, that they don't have the will to necessarily carry on the fight the way we've seen on the other side, on the Ukrainians, who are literally demonstrating the will of the people and are doing everything in their power to maintain their sovereignty.
Whereas the Russians are using conscripts and prisoners and outside mercenary groups to try to fill up the ranks of their troops in the invading army.
And so what we're seeing now is a very strong message from President Zelensky, and it's that they aren't afraid to strike Russia. And so that has been a very big concern of the U.S., who has for months now repeatedly said that they would do whatever it took to help Ukraine as long as it isn't considered escalatory by the Russians. And that has always been the big key from the U.S. angle, is this is a war between Ukraine and Russia, and they want to do whatever it takes to stay out of it. They don't want this to become a broader war. They don't want NATO to get directly involved, and that's a position that a lot of the world agrees with. But the question is the U.S. is providing Ukraine with weapons and with intelligence, but are not telling them what to do with either. And so depending on how this plays out, it'll be interesting to see President Putin's response and how the war can change moving forward.
So, I mean, that's, though, been a big part of the U.S. response to this latest Ukrainian move, is that they have simultaneously said, we're not encouraging this, but also this is Ukraine's decision what to do.
Absolutely. It's, it's plausible deniability, essentially. It is, we're providing them with weapons, we're providing them with information, we're not telling them what to do with either. And, we are quietly okay with whatever they decide to do, as long as it doesn't actually change the structure of the war and bring us into it. And so, we've heard U.S. officials go as far to say, it's up to them. Whatever they want to do is we're happy to do it. We've heard the U.S. say we've seen, in fact, the U.S. not provide specific weapons that the U.S. believes Ukraine could use to strike Russian territory, and yet they're still able to do that, which is the latest development in the war.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.